Me? I'm not much of the storyteller. That's Mary. You see, I died long before most people knew what was going on. I didn't have a lot of people to talk to about what happened that wonderful night. And that's what Mary and I call it. We call it the wonderful night. Well, I guess I could tell you a little bit about that first year. I'm a contractor. I ran a small business. It was just me. And my parents, we lived in a small village, about 500 people in our village. My parents, they knew Mary's parents, and in our culture, you make an arrangement. A wedding happens in 3 stages. There's an arrangement, and then there's betrothal, and then there's a ceremony, and that's where you make the final covenant. And we were in the second stage, Mary and I. We were in the betrothal stage, pretty far into it. And Mary came to me one day, and I was just really getting to know her, and great respect for her, and I was really learning to love her, and I think she was learning to love me. And she said, "I'm pregnant." That was a shocker, because she just didn't seem like that type. And then she said, "I'm pregnant with God's son." You know, I'd heard some big ones. Some fishermen, they were friends of mine. So, I mean, I've heard some stories, but... So, I didn't really know what to think. Maybe she was... So, I just thought I liked her, and I respected her, and it hurt, and I was embarrassed, of course, but I just figured we'd just try and not make a big deal about it. But that night, I had a vision from God. That never happened before. I don't know if you guys have visions regularly. It's new for me. But it wasn't going to be the last one, because I had several. And God said it was true, and that I was going to be the stepdad of his son. And so I was. And that wonderful night happened. We met some new people. Some of them were a little crazy. Some of them were really wise. And they left us some gifts, which was nice. It helped us get established, get a house. But it wasn't long after that the king in your world, whoever runs your world, imagine that, your president sending his SEAL team to come and kill you. The king sent his best team to come and murder my son. And once again, God showed up in a vision. And so we left. We went to Africa. And we hid out in Africa for a little while. One night I got a vision from God again that said that the king died and it was all right to go home again. And the night before we packed everything up, Mary and I just sat around the campfire, and again, I didn't have many people to talk about this with. It was Mary and I. I say, "Mary, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing as a father, let alone as a father of the Messiah." And she'd take my hand and she'd remind me that life is about having faith, about taking the next step, even when you don't know where you're going. And so I guess when I think back about the wonderful night, the delight that rose in my heart, those early years, I would say to you that my soul felt its worth. I was included in God's love story. And for that, I'll be forever grateful. So if you've never celebrated Advent before, I grew up celebrating Christmas, of course. Advent was fairly new for me, but Advent is something the church has been celebrating for centuries. It's a little bit more of a liturgical, when I say liturgical, kind of a higher church expression. But what's beautiful about Advent is you get to participate with people across denominations and people that have been a part of something throughout the centuries. So perhaps for some of you that aren't familiar with Advent, you may have been celebrating it, didn't know it. If you take the words like hope and peace and love and you hang them on your Christmas tree, those are Advent words. If you've heard words like anticipation, longing, expectation, these are words connected to Advent, and they've been connected to the church calendar as a way to look forward to the celebration of the coming of the King. And of course, there's kind of a dual meaning there. The first is looking forward to Christmas Day when we celebrate the birth of Christ, but also looking forward to the future return of Jesus. And so Advent is really a celebration of those things. It's the coming of Christ. And so we light a candle each week as a remembrance and a recognition, and then you see that white candle over there. If you want to come up, you can see some of those Advent prayers. And then on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve for us, we'll light the Christ candle. So this year at Advent, we're going through some of the characters in the story of Christmas. And so, of course, today we're having a conversation about Joseph, and I want to read to you from what is, you've heard it on Charlie Brown, you've heard it many times, I'm sure, but it's that quintessential, it's the Christmas reading that sets up the stage for the story of Jesus. It's found in Luke chapter 2, it begins in verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. Joseph is heading to the town of David called Bethlehem. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee, where he grew up, to Judea, which is a southern trip, to Bethlehem, to the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, a time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son, wrapped him in cloths, placed him in a manger, because there was no room for him in the inn. So here you have this couple, as you heard in the monologue, that was betrothed. Mary became pregnant with God's son, and they are immediately on the road to fulfill the duty of their imperialistic dictators. Now, there is something wedged into the very opening line of this story that I just don't want us to miss, just as a way of reference. Caesar Augustus was seen as one of the greatest Caesars. He was responsible for a great deal of the wealth and the Roman peace that was happening in the Roman Empire, and so pretty soon he was revered as a god. As a matter of fact, they used the term, they would speak of the gospel. The gospel in Roman times was the good news that the Son of God had come to the earth, and it was Caesar Augustus. So when you hear some of that language, some of the early Christians took that from the empire of the day. That there's this gospel, there's this breaking news, it's good news, it's great news, the Son of God has come. Of course, the irony that's wedged into this passage is that you have a man who is considered a god, and you have in the same passage a man who is coming to the earth who actually was God. And the world didn't know it. And the implication from this, which is I think the implication that happens often in the irony wedged into the pages of this book, is that mankind often thinks they have it down. Mankind often thinks they know what's going on. Mankind often thinks they have it under control, that they see everything. Of course, we don't. There is so much more to the story, and often what's up is down and what down is up. And this happens over and over again. Throughout Jesus' teaching, he's talking about a world upside down. He keeps using the phrase, the kingdom of heaven is here. And what he's saying is there's a totally different way of looking at things. Jesus is always looking at the world through the lens of the Creator. Mankind is typically looking at it through the lens of his own ego. The whole passage begins with a man wanting to get a number of who was out there so that he could tax them. Jesus was born because of a desire for taxation, to make sure that money could be stripped from the inhabitants of the land to build an egoic empire. Everything about mankind, apart from God, is to build its own world, make him or herself God, place themselves at the center. Jesus, of course, is coming, displaying humility, saying that everything is meant to be in reverse. And we have this character who shows up in the Bible, this person who's in the story, and his name is Joseph, the stepdad of Jesus. And he's such an interesting person, I think, for a lot of reasons. First, let's hear what the Bible has to say about him. In order to do that, we get a little bit more information in the book of Matthew. Matthew 1:19 says this: after Mary came to Joseph and told her what was happening about being pregnant, his response, and Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, planned to send her away secretly. But when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Matthew 1:24, a few verses later, Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. What does that word righteous mean? Righteous, I think it's a difficult word in our language, because I think we think of righteous, we think of one of two things. You think of somebody with great piety, or you think of Bill and Ted. Some of you are too young to understand that reference. It's American pop culture. Check it out. But when we think of the word righteous, I don't think it rings true, because most of us aren't like, wow, I just really felt righteous today. Again, unless you were on the West Coast about 20 years ago. So a better word when we read this is, what was the deal about Joseph? What was special about him? And Joseph, her husband, being a man aligned with God, a man centered in Christ. The picture here, the implication is, this was a man whose demeanor, posture, and attitude was one that reflected Jesus. So this is a righteous man. This is a man who is aligned with the kingdom. This is a man who is following God's ways. Matthew 2:13 through 14 speaks of the story about when Herod is after Jesus, is set out to kill him, and they find out in this conversation with the Magi. Now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you." So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He got up and took the mother and took the child. There's a couple of action phrases I'm giving you in these passages. I'll circle back to them. And then after Herod dies, God interacts with Joseph yet again. Matthew 2:19 through 21, but when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. Now I want to highlight something on Joseph, but before I do, again, I need to highlight one other element of Scripture here that is beautiful. It's great literature. God is so creative. Did you catch this, that Jesus went, because he had to run off to Egypt to find a place for provision, in this case to hide from being killed. Do you remember way back in the Old Testament, there was this group of people that went off to Egypt because there was a famine in the land for great provision? Of course, then they became slaves. But then this thing happened, this Exodus, and they were taken from the land of Egypt, and they were taken to a very special place. The place was then referenced as the Promised Land. You know what we call that place? The nation of Israel. It shouldn't be lost on us that Jesus is taken down into Egypt and he comes up out of Egypt back into the Promised Land. This is a picture yet again of God rescuing his people. God does all kinds of things like this just as a way to say, in case anybody's not paying attention, the Messiah has come. And he gives you these layers of beauty that here he comes literally out of Egypt to come and be the Messiah to rescue his people. Once again, here is God rescuing his people. Now, when it comes to Joseph, what are these action phrases? What do we learn about him? First of all, it says this. He went, he did, and he got up. He went, he did, he got up. What I hope we'll see about Joseph here is that he's a man of integrity. He chooses what is right irrespective of what people think and regardless of what is unknown and uncomfortable. He's an example to us in this way. And maybe to help set the stage, think about it like this. Here's what we don't read. God called Joseph. God guided him. God spoke to him. And here's what we don't read. And Joseph panicked. And Joseph second-guessed God's instructions. And Joseph called his mother and talked for her for 2 hours to see if she really thought God was telling him that. Joseph hesitated to act in fear of exposing the child. Joseph didn't understand why God would lead him this way, so he refused to move. Joseph was frustrated with God for not revealing what he was up to. After all, it had been 3 days. That's what we don't read here. But perhaps, maybe in our stories, we might have read one of those. That when God speaks, sometimes we don't listen. But we have excuses and hesitation. And sometimes we get paralyzed. Stephanie and I were talking in between the two gatherings, and we were talking about how both of us could relate because we grew up, I would say, in kind of a faith tradition where there was so much fear about making the wrong step that we wouldn't step at all. I didn't fully understand growing up that God redeems all things. And that faith is to step forward in the midst of the unknown. And if God calls, even if I'm unsure, I'm meant the best that I understand, the best that I can with what I have. I'm stepping forward into that unknown. And if I get it wrong, I can have faith that God redeems all things. It's a life principle, but it's certainly a scriptural principle that we're meant to stay in motion. Which is why Sabbath is so important, because our pause, our Sabbath pause for reflection, for nourishment, to actually slow down and stop is very intentional. But it's not lazy. And it's not paralysis. The principle here, and I think one that Joseph is embodying for us, is that we stay in motion. You keep getting up. You keep showing up. Faith means you keep responding to the call of God as you know it today. You go, yeah, but Jamie, I think there's so much more for me, and there's other things I think God's saying, and I don't know about this. What do you know? Well, I'm a dad. Great, show up and be a dad. Well, I need to provide for my family. There was this thing in Genesis about work. Great, go to work. Sometimes we don't obey because we want a greater understanding of the bigger picture. And if Joseph shows us anything, do you think Joseph had any clue about the story that was about to unfold? That here in Nashville, Tennessee in 2017, we'd be having a conversation about him? I'm pretty sure that was beyond what he could imagine. What is God up to in your life and in my life that's beyond what we can imagine? And we get stuck because we want to know. Joseph is an example of someone who leans into his fears and learns from the adventure. In spite of huge questions, including protecting the Messiah, the Son of God, he's responsible for him. Joseph is obedient to the simple directions of God. And this is interesting. In this, the greatest story ever told, Joseph is the only main character that is never quoted. We actually don't have one word from Joseph ever spoken. And I think we're getting something. I think the writers give us that for a reason, because I think Joseph is the quiet engineer type who's comfortable in the background of the story, and yet who is no less important. He's a major player in the story. But he's content to be in the background. It's almost as if Joseph didn't need to be quoted because the absence of his words magnifies his behavior. Have you ever been around somebody like that? They don't talk much, but what they do. You ever been to a funeral? Somebody's getting up and telling stories, and you're like, wait, what? They did what? They did that? They did what? I have a number of those stories where somebody served this person and took care of this person, and no one had any idea. And they never let anybody know. They just quietly went about loving people and loving God. I think it's easy to sometimes be in a role like that and feel like you're ignored. It's easy to feel like life in the background is something that isn't important. I've lived seasons of my life where I felt ignored or not noticed. I don't know how many of you had amazing middle school experiences. Mine was not amazing. It was full of pain. It was full of loneliness. I was ignored. I'd sit by myself with my lunch bag in the cafeteria day after day. I eventually tried to do whatever I could to try and get attention. So I began to do stupid things. As a matter of fact, my golden retriever this morning got up and he's walking through the house with a pair of pants in his mouth. I'm like, I get that. I did that in middle school. Not pants in my mouth, although I may have done that too. But when you do stupid things to get attention. See, sometimes when you're in the background, we're not content to be in the background. When we feel ignored, we feel lost. We feel not known. Does that mean our role is not just as important? Does it mean something isn't happening? I'll tell you the story that I couldn't see from 6th through 9th grade, which were my hardest, most painful, loneliest years. What I couldn't see is that I had all kinds of space for my imagination. That God was blowing wind in the sails of creativity that I otherwise would have never experienced. And I now look back with gratitude in the midst of all that pain. I couldn't see it then. That sometimes when we're in the background or sometimes when we're ignored, we get frustrated. And we feel like God's ignoring us. Can I just tell you today, God's not ignoring you, He's including you. You just may not know it. Perhaps you don't know how. Perhaps you don't know when. But I'm going to say to you today, you have two general options. You can be really frustrated with God because you don't see the bigger part of the story. Or like Joseph, you can walk in faith. And be okay that if right now the role is in the background. Do you know there are people who show up every Sunday here early, the folks who run the lights, who run the sound. There's no spotlight on them. They're in the background, yet without them this doesn't happen. How many of you feel like that's your role in your family? If you're a mom, I know you felt this at some point. It's the day in, day out. It's the meals. It's the laundry. It's the driving the kids here. It's the doing and it doesn't feel like a major role, and yet it is a major role. You're the most significant person perhaps in the life of your child, maybe you and your spouse, but you're shaping the life of another human being. Your role is massive, and I get it. It's hard to see it when you're in the weeds, but that child, God's going to use that child to somehow impact the world. To trust is to have faith. Brene Brown says this: faith minus vulnerability and mystery equals extremism. If you've got all the answers, then you don't call what you do faith. Joseph was lost in the mystery of God. And when I say lost, not disoriented. It was just beyond anything he could understand. But vulnerability, do you know what a baseline understanding of vulnerability is? It's to show up. And I'm talking about showing up relationally, showing up emotionally. Yes, sometimes it's showing up to work. But vulnerability is just simply showing up. Why? Because there's risk. If I make myself present to you, you could hurt me. And if you hurt me, I'll have pain. And God will redeem all things. And the book of James reminds me that if I count all my suffering joy, it's worthwhile because it breeds in me a perseverance and a deeper faith, and then I keep showing up. Or we can go, I don't want to feel pain, and I don't want to trust God, and in my quest for certainty, I refuse to move. I'll stay still until God shines the spotlight on me, makes it abundantly clear, and then I'll do something big. You see how the frame is off? You see how the filter doesn't work? It's mankind saying, God, you need to do it my way. And of course, God's saying, well, when I do it that way, I just really build your ego. So if you'll trust me in the midst of the unknown, then you will be reminded that every good and perfect thing comes from above. What made Joseph qualified for his calling? Actually, only grace. What makes you qualified for what God's called you to? Only grace. If you go, I don't think I'm the one. God, I feel like God's telling me to do this thing, but I don't know if you're probably not fully qualified. I don't know that anybody ever really is for anything. It's grace. God just chooses us. And we step into a role. Maybe a role we're uncomfortable with. Maybe a role we're not even sure we're meant to be in. Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm a pastor. We don't get it. We don't understand it. But we press forward in obedience based on what God is leading us into. Here's the thing. Mercy triumphs over judgment. So when you walk forward and you go, I don't know if this is the right thing, but I've got the best I can tell, mercy triumphs over judgment. If you go with a willing heart, if you go trusting God, then he will bless that faith and he will carry you forward and he will include you in his glory. Eugene Peterson says this is a pretty good working definition of glory. Glory is this: something magnificent is going on. Joseph, he was doused in glory. And you kind of get from the picture that at least at times he knew that. Oh, he didn't know what the big picture was. He had no idea how massive this story would be. He couldn't write out what was going to happen next, but he was aware of glory. What would it be like to wake up every morning and go, something magnificent is going on? Try that with your kids over breakfast. Good morning, kids. Good morning, Dad. How are you? Something magnificent is going on. That seems a little dramatic, Dad. Well, it's better than me being angry that I don't know what's happening. And you know what, kids? I am going to walk fully into the love story before me. Because I'm no longer just singing praise songs about glory. I'm going to walk in it. God is redeeming all things. God is calling me to be obedient. God is calling me to take the next step, and that's called faith. I can get frustrated, or I can trust that there's more to the story. Hebrews 12, chapter 1, let us strip off and throw aside every encumbrance, unnecessary weight, and that sin which so easily, readily, deftly, cleverly that clings to us and entangles us. And let us run with patient endurance and steady and active persistence the appointed course of the race that is set before us. What is set before you today? That's where you step. That's where you run. And just acknowledge something magnificent is going on. As Jesus grew up, he gathered his followers. We call them disciples. Like us, they were in an ever-present quest for certainty. We find that by them asking questions often. Some were leading from curiosity, but often they just wanted answers. Instead of giving them what they asked for, Jesus uses their questions and takes them into uncharted territory and leads them into a trust relationship that would ultimately transform their lives. I think Jesus would have said this to his disciples. I think he does, and I think he says it to us. You're obsessed with facts. I want you to acquire a taste for truth. And I am the truth. Glory is surrounding you. It's in the person of Christ. He's come to rescue your soul and redeem the world, and include you in the process. What a privilege for all of us, if we would but have eyes to see and ears to hear, that we get to be included in this great love story. Would you pray with me? Before I pray, just a place of reflection. Let's stay present to this moment right here. Is the Spirit speaking to your heart? Is God offering you any guidance or direction? Does your mind travel? Does your imagination kick in? Is there a vision emerging in your mind? The vision might be as simple as, tomorrow I'm going to wake up with a different attitude. This afternoon I'm going to speak out how grateful I am for the little things. In this moment right now, I'm going to tell God that I do trust him, regardless of what I don't know and can't see. If you can hear from God, would you respond? Would you thank him for including you in his wonderful story? Just a minute, the band is going to sing. You're welcome to sing along. You're welcome to let them sing the songs over you. You're welcome to stand or sit. Just be present. It's the melodies and the harmonies, the words, and more importantly, the voice of God. And perhaps you're meant to sing out and sing back. Perhaps you're meant to sit and listen and absorb. Would you be in his presence? Father, thank you for the ever-present invitation to be known by you. I remember vividly those times of feeling ignored, slighted, betrayed, abandoned, left out. Thank you for a moment like today where I can see clearly that in the midst of it all, I was being included, tested, refined, and yet redeemed. God, for my brothers and sisters, for those searching and exploring, and for myself, would you make clear only what we can handle? Give us the strength, courage, faith to take the next step.